All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Callie Kedinger-Cecil. I am a supervising planner here with the Community Development Resources Agency. And tonight I am presenting to you all some proposed changes to our zoning text amendment. So periodically our zoning code will be amended in order to ensure that our code is up to date with current standards and regulations, that it's applicable with any new laws that have been passed by the state legislator, if there are any clarifications that may be needed, or if there's any errors or inconsistencies, we will often do these code amendments to clarify our code and clarify our processes. So the last time our code was comprehensively amended was 2 years ago in 2022. So tonight we will be talking about a handful of changes. They are relatively minor. We are doing either changes to code definitions, establishing regulations for things that we do not currently have standards around, as well as some process improvements. So the way tonight is going to work is I will be giving a very broad overview of the proposed changes. We do have some folks who are joining us online, which I'm extremely pleased about. And after I give my presentation, we'll do some questions. Having said that, if you do think of something as I'm going through the presentation or you'd like me to clarify or define something, please go ahead and raise your hand. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, thank you very much. If you have a question, you can use the raise hand function, and our AV gentleman in the back will turn on your Zoom so that you can ask your question. Alternatively, you can also hold questions to the end. So with that, I will go ahead and get into the presentation. One thing I do want to note before we get in is I do have a sign-in sheet if you'd like to sign up and receive notifications about upcoming meetings. We also have a copy of the PowerPoint as well as a handout that goes through the code changes that I'll be discussing this evening, and then I've also got some cards out there that you can absolutely take. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing tonight. So I talked a little bit about that. But the purpose of tonight's meeting is really to provide you all with an overview of the proposed changes. And it's important to note, too, that these changes are just proposed. These are not the final form of the zoning code amendment. That final zoning code amendment will ultimately be brought before the Planning Commission and then finally the Board of Supervisors. So what we're looking for tonight is feedback from the public and to provide some information about how the code could be potentially amended and discuss a little bit about what that process will look like. So that is the purpose of the meeting. We do have one change to a section of county code that is not in the zoning ordinance. So the county code is made up of 19 different chapters. The zoning ordinance lives in chapter 17, and the majority of the changes we are proposing are in chapter 17, but we are proposing one change to chapter 9. So chapter 9 is our peace, health, safety, and welfare section of county code, and this is where the noise ordinance lives. So we are proposing one change to the noise ordinance. Right now, the noise ordinance currently allows for the county to provide an exception to the noise ordinance for property owners or projects when they are doing construction, or when a property owner requests to exceed the noise ordinance, perhaps for a special event. So there's a process outlined in our noise ordinance that says, for example, if you're constructing something and you have to do a night pour for whatever reasons, perhaps that's the only time you're able to do it because of weather or other considerations, you can request an exception from the county. There is a notification process with that, so when someone does request a noise exception, we do notify surrounding property owners. However, the current section just references the county may. And so we're proposing to amend that to say that the planning director may. This provides a little bit more clarification of who authorizes that, and also provides clarification to the public about what that process is. So that's the one change we're proposing to chapter 9. The rest of the changes are to chapter 17. We've got 18 changes. There are a lot, but I hope to go through them with enough detail that you have an idea of why we're considering these changes, but then also have enough detail so that you all can provide some feedback should you decide to do so. So we're proposing amendments to definitions, to the section of the ordinance regarding general development regulations, specific use regulations. We're also proposing a new land use category, and we're also proposing some changes to permit processes. So I want to talk a little bit about these things before we get into the proposed changes so that we all have an idea of what these terms mean. So first with definitions. The Placer County zoning ordinance has a section called definitions, and this is where different land use types or development standards like a setback are defined. And so there are some instances where a definition is not clear or it is inconsistent internally with other sections of the code, necessitating an amendment to that definition. General development regulations are simply that, your general development. So that's setbacks, that's how height is measured, for example. Other examples of general development regulations include regulations for residential accessory structures or agriculture structures, which are different from specific use regulations. And so a specific use regulation would be a section of code that actually lays out and regulates specific land uses. So these are things like bed and breakfasts, wineries, event centers, other types of land uses that require an entitlement from the county often is where these live. So again, that's things like I mentioned, bed and breakfasts, other things that require a use permit. Tonight we will also be discussing a new land use category. I'll be getting into that a little further, but we are proposing to establish a new land use for electric vehicle charging stations. And then lastly, we are also proposing some amendments to make permit processes a little bit clearer for the public, for staff, as well as decision makers. So with that, I'll get into the proposed changes. I will go through these kind of quickly, but I do want to note that the handout you have goes into a little bit more detail, including the code section. So I will provide an overview of what we're doing, and then again, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. And that also goes for our folks who are joining us via Zoom. So the first change is to accessory dwelling units. When the state passed the ADU, or accessory dwelling unit law, it replaced our previous secondary dwelling ordinance. And so in that secondary dwelling ordinance, there was a limitation that your outside covered area could not exceed 25% of the overall structure. So we've actually processed a handful of variances to allow folks to exceed this. And what we found is that this particular restriction is not found in state law. So we believe it may have been a carryover from the previous secondary dwelling ordinance. And we're considering either eliminating the limitation entirely so people could build a large outdoor covered area, or considering another limitation such as 50% or 75%. The purpose of this proposed change is to provide more flexibility and also to reduce the amount of variances, because obviously that is quite onerous for property owners. Yes?
So a real quick question in regards to that. Are we talking about it would be connected to the dwelling, not like as a separate?
That's correct,
right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Next is to the agricultural operations definition. Right now, there is no definition in the zoning code about what a bona fide agricultural use is. And this is important because there's several uses, for example, ag buildings that say you can't do this unless you're a bona fide agricultural use. And so our agricultural commissioner a couple years ago worked closely with our engineering and surveying division to develop a robust definition that clearly outlines what is a bona fide ag use. And we are proposing to take that same definition and put it into Chapter 17 of County Code. So then it will mirror what we have in what is essentially the grading ordinance. The next change is to commercial vehicle definitions. Our code is a little outdated in this regard because it currently says that if you have a vehicle that is over 1 ton, then you may be a commercial vehicle. That is problematic for a lot of new vehicles these days, particularly people who have large trucks. So we want to change that definition to be more consistent with the California Vehicle Code, and then also adjust the length. Right now, the length limits those types of vehicles to 24 feet, and we're proposing to extend that to 30 feet. The intent of this is to provide clarification to property owners, to our code enforcement staff, to our planning staff. This is something that comes up often in code enforcement spheres where we have people who maybe they're a contractor and they have a large truck and it's their personal truck and their business truck, right? Like they're using it for both. And so we have had code enforcement complaints, and because our code is outdated, it kind of puts people in a sticky situation, and we don't want them to be there. So this proposal would rectify that and provide some clarity. The next change is to fencing. This is another area that we see a lot of code enforcement situations or situations between neighbors. So we are proposing some additional language to clarify what exactly is an open fence versus what is a solid fence. And again, the hope here is that with this clarification, that everyone would have a better understanding of what is meant by open versus solid fencing.
Again, can I just ask, taking you back, whatever, to the agricultural operation definition or whatever, because this, specifically says like commercial farming or whatever. What about like hobby, farms or whatever? Do those still fit within?
Yeah, so the intent would be so that people who are engaged in active agriculture, if they are doing something that is an ag use, that our ag commissioner can take a look at what they're doing and provide a determination. So if a hobby farm is determined to be an ag operation, then they would be able to continue to do that. Unfortunately, there are people who say, well, I am doing a hobby farm, but it turns out what they're doing is really to get them, perhaps to skirt regulations for the zoning, or not the zoning ordinance, the grading ordinance, or other things like that.
On the solid fences, I don't see how 50% is a solid fence. That's a real see-through solid
No,
fence.
you're right. When I translated that over, because I was trying to make it a little bit more simplified, and I must have messed that up. So that would be for, I'll have to go back and look.
I think a solid fence would be like 90% or 10% visibility.
I want to say that that's what it is. I copied that over incorrectly.
Okay.
So let me, what we'll do is I'll get your information, and then I can be sure that I am providing the correct information. And then what I'm also going to be doing too is posting this online, and I will be sure to correct that. So when people go back, they can see what the correct proposal is. Thank you for catching that. So next, in addition to other fencing changes, our code currently does not allow, it doesn't have any regulations around barbed wire and electrical fencing. And so we've had some property owners and businesses out in particularly our Sunset area that have requested this fencing for security purposes. And so we're proposing some regulations around this. And it's important to note that the proposed barbed wire and electric fencing would only be allowed in commercial and industrial zone districts. We would have regulations about how high they can be, that they could not be adjacent to a school or a residential area. So we would ensure that there's some strict standards around that to ensure that it doesn't create a safety hazard, because the intent is really for security.
So the barbed wire, though, obviously that would be used in agricultural areas, so is that gonna?
This is not intended to regulate this type of fencing in agricultural areas. It would just be for commercial and industrial. No, that's a great question though, because in addition to barbed wire fencing, people in ag, and I myself have had livestock, I use, the temporary electrified fencing. And so this is not meant to regulate that. It's meant to establish regulations around commercial and industrial areas.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. This next one, I am anticipating, or I'm hoping actually for feedback. I'm hoping for feedback on all of these, don't get me wrong, but I think this particular section of the zoning ordinance has historically been sticky because we unfortunately have people who skirt our regulations. And so we have tried over the years to have a definition that captures all of the potential issues that arise from private property owners doing events. A big issue with event centers is unfortunately what ends up happening with them is neighbors end up policing them, right? Because the events are happening outside of business hours, they're happening on the weekends. In other words, they're happening when code enforcement isn't around. So we're trying to create some better regulations, or not better regulations, a better definition of what a private event is. And what we're currently looking at is that the event, basically, if you do 2 or more private events, you would need a temporary outdoor event permit. And so that event permit has a fee. You do have to notify the local law enforcement agency, and then there's also conditions that go with that outdoor event. So one reason why I think limiting it to 2 might be problematic is consider families who have more than 2 children. Say you want to have your birthday party at home, and then, you know, child number 3, sorry, we don't want to pay for a TOE in addition to, you know, funding all of your siblings' birthday parties and yours. So sorry, we're not going to be able to do that. So I can see where what we currently have is not going to work. And so part of the workshopping process that we're doing is to hear from people, get other ideas. We've been working with our code enforcement staff on this as well, because ultimately they're the ones who end up being on the front line of this particular issue. So I definitely expect that this will generate more interest, particularly from those properties who do events that aren't event centers.
So, when I heard your example of the birthday party, this is just me real quick. Not knowing much either. But nobody's paying to go to a birthday party. Maybe throw in about, hey, this is a paid event. I mean, this is, you know, a business doing this, and it's gonna last up to 12 hours, the whole thing, right? But I mean, it's paid and non-paid. It's private good, public good. I mean, it's that whole thing, right?
Right, and that is a really great bit of feedback, and we've actually incorporated that in the past. So this doesn't have the actual definition up there, but it does reference that there's no fee paid. What we've experienced, however, is unfortunately there are some family members, or not family members, there are property owners who say, you know, they keep having events every weekend, they're large events, and they say, well, I'm not charging anything, it's family members, it's friends, but then they keep doing them, and it's, you know, how do you, like, right, we're not gonna stalk people on Facebook and say, well, you're friends with this person. You know, that's not how we're gonna be regulating things. It's not feasible, it's not correct. So how do we go about that? And we've gone down the route of, well, you pay a fee, obviously you are a business and you should have to get a permit. But again, we've come into situations where people are skirting the rules, unfortunately. So this is a bit of the zoning ordinance that I do expect a lot more feedback on.
If there is somewhere where there's, that we can read the actual verbiage of what you got and then just be able to provide feedback
Yes.
or whatever on that, okay.
Yeah, and so that, you know, I initially had all of my slides where I had like the existing with all of the text, and I had almost 40 slides. So that would have been a lot, to get through. So yes, we absolutely have that. It is found in our zoning ordinance, but for the purposes of the workshop, I wanted to provide something a little bit more higher level. Yeah. The next proposed change is to lot area definition. Oh.
So back to that one, I would say, well, first of all, 2 seems like maybe it seems overly restrictive, like you said. You know, we have birthday parties, whatever.
Right.
It's, you know, it seems overly restrictive. Also, on your thing here, there's just another little, I think there's a typo. It says if you have 2 or more events, you would need a permit. So that cuts it down to actually 1 without a permit. So in your summary, 2 or more would require a permit.
I think the intent was to, you know, allow at least 2.
Okay, so yeah, because that cuts it down to 1. If it's 2 or more.
Yeah. I have to take this off right now, I'm sorry.
Does that, there's probably a lot more detail on that about, what about, you know, if you're on 100 acres and nobody knows, nobody can hear you, then, you know, are you still technically breaking the ordinance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I apologize. It's like super hot in here right now and I cannot wear that. So give me a second here. The current definition of events does not reference parcel size. But that's a good idea. Perhaps that is something we can look at, because if you're on, 50 acres or more, how far away are your neighbors? So that's some interesting feedback. Thank you.
Or even if you're on 2 acres and you don't have anyone that lives around you, similar situation, but then now you're just saying, well, no, you can't do it because you're on 2 acres, even though there's nobody that's going to hear you. There's a lot around this that is going to, of course, cause lots of a big stir
Yeah, which
on both sides.
absolutely, and that's why we workshop these things, is because, I think with policy, you don't always get it right the first time. It's important to revisit, see how it's working. It's important to reach out to the community and get their feedback. So this is exactly why we do this process, so that we can get that kind of feedback, because it's an area that we've had issues with for a long time. I don't think we've gotten it right just yet, but I'm hoping this gets us a little closer.
Well, I just want to start and add in Jennifer Bias and Principal Planner Long Radio for Sally. She didn't make me use the phone, microphone. Oh, fine. Is it working? Is it working?
Yep.
Okay. I just did want to point out, right, our intention is if you are in some kind of commercial use and you do want to do events, right, our ordinance does allow for those types of businesses to go in. And this is the struggle between where people really aren't a full-fledged business, so they don't want to do a lot of maybe the improvements like roads, right? You might be out on 50 acres, but maybe you have to go through a dirt road that does have neighbors on it, so people then suddenly have concerns about, well, suddenly we're having cars that aren't normally on our roads. So there are a lot of factors that play into this, and we are just trying to struggle with when you really are just a residential use and you're wanting to have a residential party, that those are allowed, but there's this gray area between when you're just a residence and every cousin is having their wedding at your beautiful 10-acre property, and the neighbors have concerns about that the county can then say, okay, if you have 10 cousins, that's fine, but we're going to need to talk around how you can host those kind of events at your house. So it's not a no, it's just making sure that there's access and some safety issues that would also help with the neighbors if they had concerns about people driving on roads, or it's in a high fire zone and they have 100 people out there every weekend, or or maybe it's just during high fire season. So there's a lot of things that go into it, and it's not that we don't want people to have their right and access to their properties and to having their families on their properties or hosting parties. It's just there are some times where people are using our lack of having a good definition around, then maybe we have to then dig into personal financial stuff that we don't really want to get into. We just want to say if it's a family event, it's really not that big of a deal. But how many events become too much events for? And it's not just noise, right? And it's so unique. Our county is so unique. It is really hard to put a one-size-fits-all definition around property sizes or road accesses. So that's kind of what we're trying to get at, and we get it. There is going to be concerns around both sides, the people that have the neighbor or live on a road that has people that are doing this versus other people that are like, hey, we just want to have 3 kids' birthday parties. So we understand that. Hopefully that helps also put it into a little context.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jennifer. We will get to your question in just a moment. I do want to make sure that Cheryl Borkema has a chance to ask her question. Jeremy, can you please allow Cheryl to ask her question?
Hi, Kelly. Thank you. First, I just wanted to say we can't hear the questions, so when people are asking them, if you could repeat them, please, so we don't ask the same thing or we can hear what they're trying to get. My question is on delineating from wineries and event centers. So as soon as somebody puts an application in, an example was in Granite Bay, an application was in and people were operating before they even had their project approved. It finally got, escalated to enforcement, to the zoning administrator, and they finally got fined. So there's a lot, and in the meantime, you've got sometimes months where people are hosting events and it's really difficult because the neighbors become the enforcement mechanism. And so is there a way to put in here to clearly so that winery owners and event centers know what they are so that they know when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for your question, and thank you for the feedback that you couldn't hear the questions. I will be better about that moving forward. Thank you. As it relates to delineating wineries and event centers, when those uses get their permit, the conditions of approval are supposed to very clearly outline when and how events can be done. I can't speak to this particular issue that was brought up, unfortunately, but what we're proposing here is to provide clarification. And so perhaps, when we're looking at wineries and event centers, there's an opportunity there to further clarify timing. I do think that the intent with the event center ordinance is to allow commercial uses to do events following the guidelines that are outlined in the conditions of approval, as well as consistent with the zoning ordinance. So in this particular instance, it sounds like perhaps there was a winery that was operating outside of their permitted use, and it sounds like it went through a code enforcement process. But Cheryl, you also highlighted some of the issues that we have with event centers, and that it does end up being the neighbors. So again, this is an area of the code where it's not working, and so we are looking for feedback to, like I said, move that needle closer to where it is working. So thank you very much, Cheryl. And again, as people are on Zoom, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and we will make sure that your question is heard. Yes?
So I'm a similar issue always deals with, and I don't know whether there are other pieces of the regulation or anything, but about time limitations, because I'm just thinking, in my mom's neighborhood, like there's a local family that like every other weekend is having a big party with a lot of noise after 10 o'clock at night. So I'm wondering where those kind of frameworks come in.
So that would be a noise ordinance.
Callie, can you just repeat the question into the
Yes,
microphone?
thank you. So the question was, is there a time limit for other aspects of an event, including noise? Because there are times where people are exceeding the noise ordinance. And for reference, the noise ordinance establishes a time frame of when you can exceed, or not exceed, but have a sound at a certain level, and at 10 o'clock, it's supposed to drop down to, I think it's 45 decibels. And so everyone is in the county, in the unincorporated area, is subject to the ordinance. So when someone is exceeding that time threshold for the noise ordinance, then that becomes a code enforcement issue. But again, this gets back to that issue of, well, then it's the neighbors policing it, right? Because who are you going to call at 11 o'clock at night on a Saturday? So, this is, unfortunately, there will be people who exceed the regulations with zoning text amendments. You can get pretty far, but people will always skirt the rules, unfortunately. So, but thank you for the question. So the next changes that we're going to be looking at are to lot areas. So there are two changes we're looking at for lot area definitions. This includes to update the definition to include the gross area. And so what that means is we would now be looking at a lot and considering its size that includes the easements. So say you have a parcel and you have a road that's adjacent to it. As the code is currently written, it says that you net out that easement area. So then your actual lot area might be smaller, and then that has implications to, are you able to subdivide it? Are there other uses that are tied to minimum lot size that you're now not able to do because you happen to have a road easement on your property? So we're proposing to change that to include the gross area with no exclusions for easements. Another change that didn't make it on the slide, but I do want to draw your attention to on the handout. And I will be posting this handout for those who are online, and I'll read it to ensure that you also hear what we are proposing here. And so this is to parcel size deviations. And so what this is getting at is it's related to minimum lot area, but it's really to consider a pathway that would allow someone who is very close to the minimum lot area per their zoning, say they have a legal non-conforming lot that was created before the Subdivision Map Act, or when surveying was a bit less technical than it is now. So say you're in a 20-acre minimum area, and because of these things, you have 19.8 acres. Well, under the code as it's currently written, you would not be able to further subdivide your property. But your neighbor down the road, who has 20 acres, they can. And the only difference is that you have a legal non-conforming lot that was created prior to the Subdivision Map Act, or perhaps it's a function of the surveying that was done, and it's just a hair under that minimum lot size. And so we're looking at establishing a pathway, perhaps what we currently have is, or what we're looking at is a parcel size deviation. And so this would allow for lot splits on parcels that are zoned agricultural exclusive, farm, and forestry that are at least 95% of the minimum lot size requirement, and provided that all other standards are met, could subdivide their property. I think that the proposal we're looking at, there's a lot of different ways to go about this. There's other jurisdictions that have a pathway for this, so more to come on this particular one. Not to say that there won't be more to come on the others, but I do think that this one, it's different than what we've currently allow. We don't have a variance process for this, for example, so you wouldn't be able to come in and get a variance for it. So perhaps that's the pathway, perhaps it's a use permit. So there's a couple different ways to go about it, but that's what we're looking at. Because we have had folks who have said, I am just a hair under what we're at, and I'd like to subdivide, and I can't. I know that in other places it's allowed. Why can't I do it here in Placer County? So that's what we're looking at.
When you talk about ag, are you also talking about like res ag?
We have considered res ag. It's something we actually talked about. Thank you, Jen. So the question was, what about residential agricultural? And to clarify that further, would this particular change to the code to allow for parcel size deviations be applicable to parcels that are zoned residential agriculture? That's something we actually did talk about at the Planning Commission. There are, I don't remember the numbers, but there are, I want to say, over 5,000 parcels in Placer County that are zoned RA. The vast majority are 5 acres or less. And so one thing we're considering with the parcel size deviation is, do we want to limit that such that the resulting parcel sizes would be a minimum of 5 acres or a minimum of 10 acres? And in Res Ag, there's a lot of parcels that wouldn't meet that. And so one bit of feedback we got from one of the planning commissioners was, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing because you're kind of self-limiting the amount of potential parcel size deviations on the RA zone lots. So that's a long way to say yes, we are considering that. I think that there's more research we need to do on our end, but that's absolutely the kind of feedback that we're looking for. All right, and then the next proposed change is to clarify street side setbacks. So this is for parcels that may have one or more what we consider a front. So say you've got a corner parcel. And so a couple years ago, we amended the zoning ordinance to allow for that second front, if you will, to be considered a street side. So for example, and we'll use a Res Ag zoned parcel as an example, say it's on a corner. If both fronts were considered true fronts, you would have a 50-foot setback on both sides. So that limits your potential buildable area. So there was a street side that was established, and that setback is smaller than the 50-foot front setback. But we're just proposing to add some additional clarifying language because as it's currently written, it's not entirely clear. So we want to propose some language around that just to provide more clarification around what is a street side setback and how does that apply to parcels. All right, thanks you guys for hanging in there. I know we've got a lot of changes here, and we've got a couple more. So the next is proposed changes to pool and pool and equipment setbacks on lots that are 2.3 acres or smaller. Right now, the setback is 5 feet, and we're proposing to reduce that to 3 feet. And this is because not only have we processed many variances over the years specific to pool and equipment setbacks, but also particularly in our specific plans that are starting to build out, they're noticing that their cousin developments within the cities, they're able to go closer, and so we certainly don't want new specific plans that just created their lots to go through a variance process, because how is that a special consideration based on size, shape, topography, because they're all new lots, they're all uniform. So this tells us then that there's an issue with our current code, and so we're adjusting that down to 3 feet.
Is there any noise limitation for equipment? Well, if you put some noisy equipment right next to a fence, it's going to drive the neighbors crazy.
Yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head if there's anything specific to that section of the ordinance regarding noise. Jen, do you remember if there's anything about noise? I don't think that there is.
But we can certainly, again, take that as feedback and make sure that if there's some kind of shrouds or equipment can be right, that the noise would be considered into that. We can also, again, like Callie alluded to, the cities, particularly I think the city of Roseville has a 3-foot setback. We'll make sure we look at their code and see if they have a problem, if they have any language around noise of equipment. But nowadays I do think pool equipment and a lot of equipment has been designed to be more residential friendly, since the lots are getting smaller and smaller. The areas to put these outdoor equipment are getting smaller and smaller, and the manufacturers take that into consideration.
Thank you, Jen. And for those who are online, the question was, what about noise when your pool equipment is closer to a property line, and obviously that equipment generates some level of noise. So thank you for that question. All right, so the next 2 changes are relatively minor changes in that they're just clarifying some incorrect references. So our ground mount solar section of the ordinance incorrectly references a setback section, but it's supposed to reference a setback section for water courses. And so we're just proposing to change the code section that it's referencing so that it's referencing water course setbacks. I think right now it's referencing the front setback definition when it should actually be referencing water course setbacks. The other change is to the development standards table for heavy commercial. A couple years ago, when we did our zoning code amendment, we believe what happened was that the footnote that says that if you have a heavy commercial use and you're adjacent to residential, that you need to have a 50-foot setback, and that footnote was inadvertently removed. And so we're proposing to put that footnote back in. And then the next change is to height measurement. Again, this is a very minor change. Right now, the section of the ordinance states that height is from the approved pad, and so we're proposing additional language to note that it's from the approved housing or building pad grade. The next change is to parking lot surfacing, which is to allow alternative all-weather surfaces on lots that have 5 spaces or fewer on a case-by-case basis. Right now, the code allows for 10. That change came about in 2022. And that change came because we did have a number of small businesses that are located in residential areas seeking variances for their parking surfacing standard. And so we had 10. There's been some discussion about perhaps that's too much, so we're looking at maybe 5. And then for those spaces beyond 5, we're discussing this with our colleagues in our engineering and surveying division to further discuss what regulations may be appropriate around this particular use. All right, the next change is to establish a new land use definition in land use in general. So The county adopted a couple years ago a sustainability plan, and in that plan there was a policy to establish an electric vehicle readiness guide. And part of that electric vehicle readiness guide talks about the zoning ordinance establishing a new land use to allow for electric vehicle charging stations. So if someone wanted to come in and put in an electric vehicle charging station, it would be allowed to be used for electric vehicles, electric bikes, or other non-carbon producing modes of transportation. It would be allowed in certain zone districts with a minor use permit. They would have to adhere to development standards, including setbacks and landscaping. But we are also proposing language, so if someone that is operating a standard gas station wants to convert to an electric vehicle charging station, they could do so without a use permit. They would just go through a design review process. So we're proposing to allow them primarily in our, well, not primarily, solely in our commercial and industrial zone districts. So that would be things like general commercial, heavy commercial, highway services. I'm not going to go through and read all of them, but this gives you an idea of where they would be allowed: airports, business parks, industrial parks, etc. And again, they would have to go through a minor use permit process to establish this use. And then we're also proposing changes to signs. So there's a couple changes we're proposing for several different reasons. And some of these reasons include allowing for businesses to use technologies that are currently available to them to reduce the number of variances that we currently process for commercial signage, as well as establish regulations for off-site real estate signage. So as it relates to sign regulations and frontage and freestanding signs, businesses are pretty limited. So right now, our code says that if you're a shopping center, you can only display the name of the shopping center. You cannot display the individual tenants. So across the way here at the shopping center where the Old Navy is located, you may have noticed that they have a sign and it has the name of the shopping center and then the various names of the tenants. And they actually had to get a variance to allow for the individual tenant names to be on there. So we've actually processed many variances for shopping centers to allow them to have multiple tenants. And so we're proposing to change that section of our ordinance so that you can have, I believe it's up to 6 tenant names on that sign. So this would provide greater flexibility for commercial businesses as well as reduce the amount of variances that we're processing. Another thing we're proposing to change is wall frontage. So right now a business can only have a wall sign on what is considered a building frontage, which is where the entrance comes in. So again, the shopping center across the way is another good example of this because they had to get variances to put the wall sign facing Highway 49. Because per our code, that is not considered a building frontage because there is no entry that you go through from the Highway 49 or Bell side. It's from where it's facing the parking lot in that particular shopping center, as an example. We're also proposing some standards around digital display signs. So this would be, for example, the church down, or not the church, the hospital down the street here, they have a digital display sign. And so we currently don't have regulations around this. We have some language around date and temperature time. But aside from that, we don't really have anything around digital signage. And so we've gotten requests in the past to install digital signage, and so we're proposing some regulations around that. Digital signage would only be allowed with a minor use permit, and it would only be allowed for very specific uses, including for hospitals, schools, churches, and quasi-government institutions. And we would also be establishing setbacks and regulating how many you could have in a given area because we wouldn't want a proliferation of these types of signs. We're also proposing to establish some parameters around how bright they can be, as well as the types of background that they could have. Noting that with current technology, a lot of property owners can actually manage these things from a desktop. We do think that when it comes to lighting and dimming, that property owners have a lot more control over that these days. Did you have your hand up, sir?
No.
No, the gentleman behind you.
Yeah, you have one. say quasi-government agencies, I can't think of any in town, but would that be like Sierra Nevada Conservancy? I mean, when you say quasi-government agency, what are you thinking of?
There is a definition for it, and I apologize, I don't know that right off the top of my head. The Sierra Nevada Conservancy is a government agency. They are something that is through the government. I would say an example of a quasi-government agency would be, I'm trying to think here. Jen, can you think of any? I'm like blanking on this.
Again, just making sure everyone that's online knows. The question is, what is the quasi-government or quasi, and I think this has to do with, it's not exactly public, but it's not also private. So again, houses of worship tend to really be a good example. Hospitals tend to be a really good examples. Private schools, right? It's not exactly a total public, but it is open to the public and provides community services. I think the important part of this is we're not proposing for commercial businesses to be able to come in and shopping centers to be able to come in and propose these. We do have quite a few, or we have had quite a few of these requests. A lot of them are associated again with some kind of house of worship. We did have one that was requested along Highway 49. The General Plumbing store was requesting a digital sign to replace their existing, and that actually was denied at the, I believe it went to the Planning Commission, at least. So we have had a few of these requests. Again, our sign ordinance is circa 1990. So a lot of those technologies were just not there, and so we're trying to bring in some additional, if we are going to consider these, or the Planning Commission or Board are going to consider these would be some areas to regulate and where they might be more appropriate.
Thank you for that clarification. Cheryl, I see your hand raised. Jeremy, can you go ahead and unmute Cheryl? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to use Bayside in Granite Bay as an example. Our community plan discourages heavily, I can't remember the exact wording, regional sized businesses. And over the course of the past 20 years, Bayside has become a huge regional business where people are bussed in by the thousands. And so we live in rural, unincorporated. Many of our streets, we don't have street lights, only on the main thoroughfares. And if I challenge you in planning to go drive in the Bayside area at night too and see how many banners and signs they have got, like 70-foot lights now for their fields. It's not in keeping with it. It's like Disneyland, basically, in a rural environment. And so it just seems like not only it's destroying with light and sound the characters of the neighborhood, people that have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, and they keep trying to impose more and more unneighborly like things when maybe they just didn't belong there in the first place if they're going to be such a huge entity. And it's not like nobody knows where Bayside is, or they don't know where the shopping centers are. There's only like 22,000 people. Everyone knows where everything is. So I question the need for changing the entire character of a rural community to monetize for certain businesses. It just doesn't seem right when you've got all those people and then you're really giving preference to a few special interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your comment. Those are very important considerations. I think, one reason why we are proposing that this kind of signage would require a minor use permit is so that there would be a public hearing process, and also to ensure that whatever signage is proposed is complying with the applicable community plans. Having said that, we have had a lot of these requests, and as has been noted, our current sign ordinance is quite outdated, and we do want to ensure that our code is up to date with current trends and technologies. In addition to that, we are sensitive to the light issues, and that's why we would be proposing some standards around how bright things could be, as well as the types of colors that could be used. Do you have another question?
I just have a question in regards to what you said about a minor use permit, that it requires some sort of a hearing, is that what you said?
Yeah, so the question was, does a minor use permit require a hearing? And the answer is yes. A minor use permit goes before the zoning administrator. So there's different levels of entitlements, but a minor use permit is what we are proposing for this kind of signage. Property owners would be notified, and there would be a public process, and then it would go before the zoning administrator. And it is important to note that actions of the zoning administrator can be appealed to the Planning Commission, and those decisions can also be appealed to the Board of Supervisors. So if there was an instance where a church or other quasi-public facility were proposing a sign, that there would be a public process for that. Thank you for those questions. Thank you, Cheryl. So the other change I wanted to talk about is off-site real estate signage. I'm sure we've all seen real estate signs all over, and there's not always, unfortunately, some people are not great about going back and removing those signs after the sale has occurred. So we are proposing to establish some parameters around that, as well as establish parameters around the advertising. So this is something that came up a couple years ago with a subdivision in Meadow Vista. They had these big giant signs that were up down on Auburn Folsom Road, and then they had another one up here on Highway 49. And so the code as it's currently written essentially states that a subdivision can advertise until the last lot is sold. And given the size of a subdivision, that can take often a very long time. So we're proposing some time limits around that, because we don't want that kind of proliferation of signage to be everywhere. Often what happens too is these signs aren't taken care of, so over time they deteriorate visually, they become an eyesore, so we're proposing some regulations around that.
Along with the signage, the number of signs going up on telephone poles is a real problem. AR-19 or whatever they are is a huge violator of that. They must have thousands of them.
Yeah.
Is anything being done by the county, or is that up to PG&E to go after those people? I mean, it's illegal, I think, by PG&E rules to put anything on a telephone pole. So, what's happening there?
Yeah, so signs without a permit that are not discussed in the ordinance as exempt signs are not allowed. And so that is things that are affixed to telephone poles. Those are not legal. So someone could submit a code enforcement complaint. As you mentioned, if it's a PG&E pole, perhaps PG&E has an outreach or someone you could contact there. If it is on a pole, there are other poles, obviously there's light poles or other features that people put signs on, and those are not permitted signs through the county. So like I said, you could submit a code enforcement complaint because they are illegal signs, but we don't have crews going out and taking signs out. And then Jen, it looks like.
Yeah, Jen Bias again. PG&E does have a whole crew that will go out and remove signs. It's just, again, where are they spending their money, removing signs or taking care of their utilities? But yeah, you can, if it's a really bad one, you can submit a complaint to them. And then again, our road crews will also go, if there's signs put in our right-of-ways or a public road right-of-way, and you have concerns about it, it's blocking the views. But occasionally our Department of Public Works will do a sign sweep and just pick up signs that are placed in the public right-of-way. Right now it's really bad because we have an election season going on, so I'm sure they're not out there sweeping the signs just because yeah, they do their best. And if you have concerns about that, we can also follow up with the phone number to have you reach out and say this, can we go do a sweep of the signs? Because there's quite a few, you guys know where those corners are where people are always putting their signs out. And,
and just along rural roads, I mean,
Yeah.
some places there's a sign in every single telephone pole down these roads.
I have a sneaking suspicion that PG&E isn't, that program isn't as prolific as it used to be, because it's the same in my neighborhood, and I'm noticing it, even if they get taken down, it seems like they just get put right back up, and I'm like, yeah, it's very distracting and doesn't look very good.
Yeah, I think it almost needs like a graffiti task force that's going to go after these things constantly so that you eventually will discourage people from doing it because they'll realize it's not going to stay there.
And just so you know, I actually placed a public notification sign at PG&E pole about, I think it was 10 years ago, and they took it down and then sent me a nasty gram to the county, sending it back to me saying, don't put your signs on our poles. So I had no idea until that actually happened to me that it was not, it was illegal to place it on the pole. But I mean, that's an awful lot of work for them to go out, collect the sign, then mail it back. I also have a sneaking suspicion they could also start fining somebody if it's like a particular business that they collect 30 signs. But good, we'll look into that too, because we should just have an answer on for that also. There is probably an answer.
And I apologize again for those online. The question was, what about illegal pole signs? For example, like tree trimming businesses or, you know, yard maintenance signs when business owners will post that up on a telephone pole. So we actually got through everything. Like I said, I initially had 40 slides, so I'm glad that I was able to reduce that down a little bit. So we have a number of opportunities for public input in addition to the workshop we had last month. We have today's town hall. We will also be going to the Granite Bay MAC on November 7th. We will also be going to any other MACs that request us to go before them. We are also going to go before the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors. So we'll have lots of opportunity for public input. Having said that, that isn't your only opportunity. You can also reach out to me. You can reach out to other planners. Our contact information is up here. You can also email the general planning email. You can email the Planning Commission. And you can also email the Board of Supervisors clerk, and they will ensure that your questions or comments get to staff, and we will have a conversation with you. Cheryl, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you. Kelly, I did send you like right before you started my list of questions, but I wanted to make sure that I got two more things in. One was I didn't have time to digest everything, but group plus 7 homes, is that being addressed in these?
No, we are not proposing that with this set of amendments. We are looking at coming back for that. We know that there's a lot of concern around that, and we want to ensure that that is not grouped in with a set of other amendments, because we know that there is a lot of concern from the community. So it's not included with this particular.
And then the other thing I had was equivalency. So equivalency is in section, believe it's in chapter 17, and I'm recommending that it be removed because it's conflicting with the 10% code. So there's supposed to be 10% affordable housing, and now there's a conflicting code that says, oh, but you can do this other thing called equivalency, and it pushes affordable housing way out. Like, it could take 20 years for them, and they may never build it if you're not taking close track of it. And so it's a suggestion that be removed because it is a conflict, and the developers go for the easier way out, which is, oh, we want to build offsite, and we want to do in lieu fees, and we want to do whatever they can become creative with. So I'm hoping that you can look at that and consider removing that option for developers. And the other one had to do with lighting. I'm concerned that currently people can, for example, put up a sports court and then the lights shine down in your yard. I think I'm looking for language to be tightened, and I don't know which set of amendments that's in, and does it fall in the same section that you're dealing with right now?
Thank you, Cheryl, for your questions. Before I get into the lighting, I do want to note your comment about the equivalency is found within the affordable housing ordinance in chapter 15. And when we went to the board in May for the rezone program, the board did actually direct us to look at that particular section of code. And we are working on a request for proposals right now to work with consultants who are familiar with this type of regulation across the state to help us revamp perhaps some of that ordinance, and we will be coming back to the public with that. So similar to the group home, that's something we did not want to package in with this smaller set of amendments, and we will be coming back with that. Thank you for that feedback, Cheryl. And then as it relates to lighting, we don't necessarily have a lighting ordinance. We do have standards within the community plans regarding where light can go and preventing light spill onto adjacent properties. I can recall situations where we have had issues with businesses that had lighting that when they actually installed it, it turned out to be much brighter than was indicated on their photometric plans. And so we have had instances where staff will visit these places at night and perhaps modify whatever permit allowed the use to address the lighting concerns. So Cheryl, if you have a specific concern about that, you can absolutely reach out. As it relates to lighting in general, we have heard from other members of the public who want the county to consider perhaps adopting a dark sky ordinance. We often reference dark sky regulations in our documentation, but I don't believe that there's anything actually in county code that says that you have to comply with dark sky regulations. So that's another bit of really good feedback. I don't know that we'll be able to make it into this particular set of amendments, but this is something that has come up, and so I anticipate that we will be looking at this again in the future. Yes?
So just, since you mentioned or whatever about the community plans, because like in our community plan, it specifically has some things about lighting issues, and I even use that dark sky thing. I don't remember the exact wording or whatever, and so again, would we fall back to the community plans and go, excuse me.
So the question for those who are online are, some community plans do have lighting standards and do have that kind of language, and when do those regulations get applied, right? That's basically what the question was. And so we do apply those in project review. There are instances, I think, where an amendment is done, then a project is able to construct their project per that amendment. But as it relates to lighting, we have had instances where the number of streetlights, for example, is limited because there are concerns about dark sky compliance, and that is a standard from the Dry Creek West Placer Community Plan. So, but again, if there is a business or a property where perhaps it seems like they're a little too bright and they're causing a nuisance, you can always reach out to the county. You could contact staff or go the code enforcement route, and that would enable us to investigate further.
And I'm going to just want to step back and clarify for Cheryl. I believe, and we can follow up with you too on this, I believe the staff was directed to come back by February regarding the affordable housing. I think it's affordable and workforce housing ordinance that's in chapter 15. And what Callie was referring to, we're actually looking for consultant services to support the number crunching for a nexus study related to an impact fee and updating our fees. So, but staff is looking at potentially any board directed changes to that, but I understand what you're saying is the policy is the 10%, but our ordinance does have some allowances for equivalents. But this package doesn't include that, any changes to that sections, but we are working on that closely with our housing team. And then the dark sky, I did want to also mention that a lot of our community plans point to the dark sky standards, and having been a planner, looked at that standard multiple times, again, a good suggestion that would come out of this workshop could be potentially adding that to our long-range work plan to look at maybe some kind of, I know that the dark sky standards, the engineers that go into that and run those regulations have recommended ordinances We just don't have an ordinance that is a county-wide or community-wide, but a lot of our community plans reference that. And as Callie said, all of our commercial developments that have design review agreements in place, oftentimes what they say they're going to put in and then what they put in can be different. So please reach out to code enforcement, and planning will work with code enforcement to make sure they're in compliance with what we actually approved.
What would it take then to get an ordinance?
Well, we would have to, again, get direction from the Board of Supervisors to look into and do something like that. So, again, tonight's workshop is looking at these current set of changes. But yeah, if you are interested in that, it would have to come as part of our long-range work program. And again, that's being directed by the Board of Supervisors of what the planning and CEDRA is working on and changes. A lot of the changes that we're looking at here are kind of cleanup changes or changes that are currently where we are getting feedback from either communities or people that are going through or staff that's like, hey, this code is not clear and we need to make it clearer so we have an enforceable and a way to communicate what the regulations are to the public. So this is a cleanup package. And our team works on a variety of different packages. We've worked on housing packages. We're still working on some that are related to housing. And again, the same kind of notification process we'll go through and workshopping we'll go through to get community input. But right now, I can just tell you, we don't have a whole lot of capacity to take on another work task like that, but it would all come from being directed by the Board of Supervisors.
So the question for those who are online are, what would it take to get the lighting standards to be an ordinance? And so that's what Principal Planner Jennifer Bias was just speaking to.
I forgot to repeat my question.
So with that, that does conclude the presentation. Are there any, Desiree, I see your hand is up. Thank you.
Hi, Callie.
Hi.
This is Desiree Hennessy, and I just joined the meeting, so I apologize if this has been discussed previously. But I'm trying to understand some of the language back in HE 52 that was, around the May timeframe, and I didn't see that any of that had been refined or adjusted in any of these codes, and I'm not sure if that's applicable. But I had sent a letter to the planning department on June 19th with all my questions and clarifications requested. I've never received a response.
Thank you, Desiree. I did see that email right before this meeting, so I will look into what happened there because I know you and I were corresponding pretty frequently. As it relates to HE 52, so for those in the audience and for those online who aren't aware of what HE 52 is, HE 52 is Housing Element Program 52. This is a program that is proposed in the Housing Element Amendment. That amendment has not been adopted. We are working with HCD on that, and we did provide all of the comments that were received during the June amendment to HCD. So as it relates to HE 52, we are not proposing anything as it relates to the housing element programs, so programs are different than zoning code. And so zoning code is what we're talking about today. These are the regulations that are found in Chapter 17 of County Code, whereas the housing element does establish policies. And so there's some nuance there because they are related. But I think a good way to think about it is the housing element policies are an overarching regulation, and then the zoning policies and zoning ordinances are the more refined requirements that projects and property owners have to comply with. So HE 52 is the large lot program. And this isn't necessarily the appropriate forum to discuss this particular language as it relates to the housing element amendment because we are talking about Chapter 17. But Desiree, I will follow up with you tomorrow and we can discuss this further. But to answer the question, I know that was really long-winded, but we are not proposing to do anything with the housing element amendment with this set of zoning text amendments. And then Sandra, I see you have your hand up as well.
Callie, thank you for the presentation. I want to get back to the senior housing. We've been asking for that code to be updated at least 15 years. And the project that was approved, the Sequoia that's on Old Auburn, Sierra College Boulevard, that was ResAg, and it would have allowed 8 units, I believe, and there's 165 on there now. And you say you're not addressing it now. And meanwhile, we have another one coming in for 93 units. And since we've been asking for this, we've had at least 4 huge senior care places proposed and built. And we're running out of ResAg. And so by the time you get around to addressing it, it's not going to be very effective in Granite Bay. And I'm just kind of disappointed that it hasn't been addressed previously, because we have been asking for it for a long time, way back. And I can show you the paperwork on it. But otherwise, yeah. And I'll probably bring some signs to the MAC meeting, because we take down signs constantly for different housing units and gutter cleaning, and it's just disgusting what goes on Douglas Boulevard and some of our other arterial streets. But thank you for the presentation. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Sandy.
And Callie, can I make a suggestion too? Because I do know you have quite a bit of language kind of crafted around some of this, and we wanted to kind of workshop it before we started putting specific language up for folks, but we might be at the point where we should at least put the kind of here's the language in its context up, so people can also comment on that. In particular, like that fencing language, I know that again, if you want to follow up to see what is actually what the language currently says and then what the changes are. I think that might be helpful, and we might be at that point. I think, again, we didn't want to present it as if this is for sure the language we know we're going to add, but we have been working to craft the actual language. And again, it's 40 plus pages by the time you get the context of the legal code written, so it is onerous to go through. But if you have a particular area, we can help point you to what the language is and walk you through that. And again, these are all good suggestions tonight. It's really one thing to write code, put policies in place and write code, and then you ask 3 or 4 different people, and they can sometimes read and interpret that different. So it's one of our jobs as planners to come back and reaffirm or make changes to reaffirm what the actual intent was when we put it down in writing. So thank you guys for participating.
Thank you. Yeah, so we do have a project webpage that has been established for the 2024 zoning text amendments. I will be posting the clarified PowerPoint as well as the recording for this evening. So if you want to go back and listen to portions of it, you can. And as Jen mentioned, we will also make available the text document. I did want to wait until after tonight because I know that we'd be getting some good feedback, and I certainly don't want to put multiple red line documents out there that, then you're like, wait, which version of the red line were we talking about? So is there anyone else online who wanted to ask a question or provide a comment? All right, it does not appear so. Is there anyone else in the audience who has a comment or question? All right, well, thank you very much, everybody who joined us online as well as in person. I truly appreciate you being here tonight and providing your feedback. Please sign up if you haven't already done so, and feel free to take one of my cards. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep.